We're going to get started with our next panel, entitled Trump Politics and Foreign Policy Realism, A Media View. W. James Antle III is the editor of the American Conservative. He was previously politics editor at the Washington Examiner and managing editor at the Daily Caller. He is the author of Devouring Freedom: Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? Michael Anton is a lecturer and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center and a fellow at the Claremont Institute. He is also a regular Fox News contributor and served as President Trump's deputy assistant to the president for strategic communications on the United States National Security Council until April 2018. Kelly Jane Torrance is deputy managing editor of The Weekly Standard. She previously served as a film critic of the Washington Examiner and literary editor of the American Conservative. Her work has been published in the LA Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the San Diego Union Tribune. And our moderator, Dan McCarthy, is editor of Modern Age and the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Program at the Fund for American Studies. He previously served as a longtime editor of the American Conservative. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Well, thank you, Johnny, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this wonderful winter afternoon. As Johnny had mentioned, I'm Daniel McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review, and editor-at-large of the American Conservative magazine. Our panel today is going to be looking at the relationship of the media, foreign policy realism, and the politics of the Trump administration. On the Uber coming up here, I happened to pass the Robert Taft Memorial Carillon. Robert Taft, of course, the late great senator from Ohio, might be considered the patron saint of conservative realism. And I think we have sort of his blessing upon our panel this afternoon. I think we'll start by sort of asking each of the panelists a question that will allow them to explore the complexities of discussing foreign policy and the Trump administration in a media environment that really can't make heads or tails out of either American strategy or of the Trump administration itself. You've seen a number of media outlets portray President Trump as both a sort of warmonger, a sort of military extremist, and also, conversely and paradoxically, a so-called isolationist and someone who wants to retreat from the world. It seems to me that these are simply lazy reflexes on the part of the media when it comes to discussing what is in fact a quite new, dynamic, and creative administration and a foreign policy environment that is unlike anything we've seen really in the last half century, an environment in which the failures of American foreign policy under the Bush administration and under the Obama administration have cast a new light on America's role in the world, and Donald Trump is creatively trying to address that and working on creating new kinds of policies. And where they will lead, we perhaps have not yet seen. I want to begin by asking Michael Anton, who wrote what is perhaps the most important essay of the 2016 election for the Claremont Review of Books, the Flight 93 essay, and who has since served in the Trump administration, and who now is a public intellectual addressing questions of the media and government and foreign policy. Michael, what is it that the media doesn't understand about the Trump administration and U.S. foreign policy?
Well, the short answer would be all of it. But I give a longer answer. Look, the reason the media sees foreign policy through the lens of popularized versions of peer-reviewed academic work, right? So they don't really know. There's a handful of people in the media that fancy themselves foreign policy experts. Some of them write, or some of them are on TV. But most of them, and even they, see foreign policy through the lens of popularized versions of peer-reviewed social science, political science. And that reduces foreign policy to categories that we're all familiar with: isolationism, interventionism, neo-realism, liberal internationalism. We know what these categories are. The only thing the media really gets about Trump's foreign policy is that it doesn't neatly fit into any one of those categories. Therefore, they don't know what to make of it. They can see that he cherry picks pieces from the various parts. They could see that he melds them together in ways that has never happened before. They can see that he does things that don't fit neatly into any of the categories, beyond the cherry picking. They don't see any kind of common thread. And I think that confounds them. And then, there's just, this is obvious, but it probably needs to be said anyway, they just have an overwhelming, blatant hostility to him that goes beyond foreign policy, that goes into everything, his personality, the other issues that he ran on, the other issues that he's trying to implement, everything. And so no matter what he does, they're going to want to say it's bad. The old joke, my boss, I'm sure this is a joke that goes back, it's told many, many different ways, but I used to work for Pete Wilson when he was the governor of California, and he said that I could walk on water across San Francisco Bay, and the headline in the Chronicle the next day would be, "Wilson can't swim." That's kind of what the media, no matter what Trump does, as you say, when he's aggressively tweeting about North Korea, he's going to bring on Armageddon. When he goes to Singapore to meet with Kim Jong-un, he's throwing away the prestige of the United States by parlaying with a vicious tyrant. Whatever he does, and I don't know if they don't realize that they contradict themselves so blatantly, or if they realize it and just don't care. But they're willing to sort of turn on a dime and say anything in the moment, so long as it's negative.
Jim, you are the new editor of The American Conservative, a magazine that has distinguished itself as a voice of realism, as a periodical that was conservative but quite willing to criticize the George W. Bush administration for its adventurous foreign policy. What do you see as being the role of The American Conservative in this new and rather different and transformed foreign policy landscape?
Well, it is a rather new and transformed foreign policy landscape, though not nearly as much as I would like, or I think most people associated with the magazine would like. But it's certainly very different than when you and I were young assistant editors at the magazine during George W. Bush's administration. There really wasn't anything going on in the Republican Party except at the margins that showed any willingness to dissent from Bush-Cheney sort of neoconservatism, or sort of the appropriation of what we needed to do perhaps to respond to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, to end up fighting a bunch of wars that they wanted to really fight in the 90s and before. So I think President Trump is much more complicated than that. I think he is less of a systematic political thinker in certain ways, which enhances that complexity, and that there are, just as there's contradictions in the media coverage of him, there are some contradictions in his foreign policy, but he has a certain set of impulses. I think that the one that is most congenial, I think, toward our perspective is that he doesn't really view the United States as a sort of embryonic United Nations, and that shapes some of his better instincts on foreign policy. It certainly shapes some of his approach to immigration. So, I think on the one hand, TAC has the same role it did under Bush in terms of trying to hold fast to a certain set of principles and hold whomever is in power accountable to those principles. But I think also we have to recognize a little bit of diversity and a little bit of change within the foreign policy debate. I think on the one hand, I think on the positive side of the ledger, President Trump has certainly said a lot of good things and has demonstrated that you can speak very critically of the Iraq War, very critically of George W. Bush, very critically of neoconservatives, and still be successful electorally within the Republican Party, that the conservatives of the heart that Pat Buchanan talked about in his 1992 and 1996 campaigns, the people who didn't read Edmund Burke or Adam Smith, but were instinctively in some way conservatives of neighborhood and playground and community, that there is a non-neoconservative approach to these questions that can speak to these people, which did not seem apparent in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 or for most of George W. Bush's administration. I think another positive is that Whether he can succeed ultimately in his diplomatic aims, it's pretty clear to me that President Trump would rather go down in history as the guy who solved the North Korea nuclear problem or solved other intractable foreign policy problems rather than the guy who turned these places into glass or into a parking lot. And that shouldn't necessarily require the highest praise, but it is certainly something noteworthy, especially given his Jacksonian perspective. I think similar to Barack Obama, we've seen just because he has some good impulses, has not necessarily really translated into a major break with the foreign policy status quo in a substantive way yet. Whether that's because of personnel, whether that's because of just the challenges of changing the national security status quo, given the bipartisan Washington consensus, or whether it's because he does not necessarily believe or know how to fully follow through on the less interventionist things he said about foreign policy, I think will be open to debate and really for the rest of his administration and perhaps afterwards, depending on how things go. But I think for TAC, I think we really need to have an awareness of the opportunities that Trump has demonstrated to sort of move the Republican base away from the neoconservative and the more reflexive, hawkish view of foreign policy, that even if Trump himself on a policy level never fully seizes on those opportunities, while at the same time holding the administration accountable as we would do with any other administration.
Kelly Torrance has a very wide experience in the media. She is unusual in having gone from being literary editor of The American Conservative to working as deputy managing editor of The Weekly Standard. She's also a regular commentator on both CNN and Fox News and other channels as well. And she hails originally from Canada, so she brings a certain international perspective to this panel, as well as a professional perspective. Kelly, tell us a little bit about how the media seems to react when you try to explain conservative perspectives on foreign policy to them. Do they understand it? Do they seem to grasp the complexities, or do they have a rather pat view of things?
No, it's a great question, Dan, and I agree with Michael Anton that it's hard for them because they see things in terms of categories, which of course is something very human. And so they would like to put people into a category because that makes them easier to understand. And with Donald Trump, you cannot do that. But even conservatives, they have trouble with. And when Bill Clinton, of course, did his Kosovo mission, the media thought that kind of intervention was a great thing. And then, of course, when Republican presidents do something similar, media, mainstream media, as people like to say, thought very differently. So, they do like to put people into categories, and Trump is difficult. Now, I think a lot of people had Trump in the category, of course, as an anti-interventionist, and America first, of course, was one of the things he said a lot during the campaign, and I think that's probably why a number of people actually liked him and voted for him. So I think some of his supporters were a little surprised when, in 2017, in response to a chemical weapons attack in Syria by Bashar al-Assad's government, that Trump actually ordered airstrikes. And they were very targeted. It was against the air base that the chemical attacks had apparently originated from. But it was very confusing, I think, both for his supporters and the media, because they had seen Trump as an anti-interventionist, one label that's easy to put on people, and here he was, sending bombs into Syria. Now, I didn't have a huge problem with that because it was a very targeted attack, but you always have to worry when something like that happens. How much further can it go? And one of the things I thought was interesting about that was why Trump did it. And it seemed that, from what I heard, that it was the images of especially children, just in misery and suffering horror from this chemical weapons attack that made Trump decide to do it. And a lot of people didn't think of Trump as someone with a heart. And so that certainly was not an America First action. Of course, it was a humanitarian action. But when people talk about America first, too, and what is in America's interest in foreign policy, people often, I think, have a very narrow view of what that might mean. And so I think of Iran, for example. So Donald Trump ended the Iran nuclear deal that was signed by his predecessor, Barack Obama. I think he did the right thing. Now you think, well, why America shouldn't be in the Middle East. America shouldn't be involved in the Middle East. Well, think about all of the different things that Iran is involved in. Now they fund Hezbollah, and Hezbollah actually does drug running in Latin America, and a lot of those drugs end up coming to the United States. Well, that's one of the things that Donald Trump is constantly complaining about, is the drugs pouring in through our weak border we're without the wall yet. Some of those. It's not just drug running, too. They do money laundering, and there's actually tons of car dealerships in the United States that Hezbollah launders money through. So when you think of America shouldn't be involved in the Middle East, well, the Middle East is involved in America. And so I sort of urge people to take a bit of a wider perspective on what is in America's interest and what is America's national security. Now, it took me a couple minutes to explain that, and there's a lot more that I could explain, but I have a limited amount of time here. So imagine, going on TV and trying to fit this into a 30-second soundbite. It's almost impossible. And so Michael just laughs. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. Foreign policy, I think, is one of the most complicated of any issues you can discuss in politics. And especially for people who aren't necessarily familiar with, the issues around the world. I mean, I think a lot of Americans don't even realize that Iranians are Persian and not Arabs, for example. So, you're working in 30-second sound bites. You're trying to be short, sharp, say something that's really memorable, but also get ideas across. And it's very difficult. And in foreign policy, I think that's one reason that the media has some trouble sometimes with Trump's foreign policy. They say, well, he coddles dictators. He's, of course, expressed fondness many times for Vladimir Putin. He's also praised Erdogan, Turkey's Erdogan, who, of course, Turkey jails more journalists than any country in the world. Yet, look at what's happened. There's been many sanctions against Russia that apparently Trump himself is not necessarily happy with. But again, the President of the United States does not control and micromanage everything that goes on in his administration. And, some people might complain and call it the deep state, but, the people at Foggy Bottom are working, and Donald Trump is, to some extent, letting it happen. Now, one of the problems, I think, also for the media is that Trump can be very unpredictable. And I think the Syria strike was one good example of that. I was in Korea in February for the Olympics, and I had a meeting with one of the top North Korea analysts there in Seoul, and he was actually an Obama guy. He was one of Obama's envoys to the six-party talks. And he told me, now I'd like to chat with him again to see if he's changed his mind, but he told me he liked Donald Trump's policy on Korea, and I use the word policy loosely. And, the media would go nuts after every Trump tweet talking about Little Rocket Man. And, a lot of people here in D.C. were worried that Trump was going to somehow start, a third world war, or at least, somehow provoke Kim into sending a bomb over to the U.S., although I wasn't worried at first because it looked like Kim could probably only reach the West Coast. So, I wasn't sure. But, the media were freaking out about every tweet. And this guy, again, an Obama guy, told me that he thought this was pure genius because you're dealing with a madman, he thought, in Kim. And Donald Trump was playing the unpredictable, maybe he's mad himself gambit, and he thought it was working. He thought this is the only thing that made Kim start to worry and come to the table. So, so that unpredictability, it's difficult for the media to understand it, and even us, right? I mean, we're talking about different things Trump does. Nothing fits into an easy category, and so I think there's lots to discuss on this panel.
That was one of Richard Nixon's strategies in foreign policy as well, to keep things a little unpredictable and to make opponents, rivals, and others question just how far would Richard Nixon go. Let me turn this back to Michael Anton. In addition to asking him to kind of give some thoughts on what we've just been discussing here on the panel, maybe also say, if the media is fixated on labels, what would be the optimal label to apply to the Trump administration?
First, I just want to pick up 2 points that we heard and tie them together. You heard the word Jacksonian. This is a sophisticated audience. I assume you know. That comes from a very famous foreign affairs article in 1999. I mean, before that, but why we're talking about it in these terms, by Walter Russell Mead, in which he identified the 4 foreign policy traditions in American history: Wilsonianism, Jeffersonianism, Hamiltonianism, and Jacksonianism. And Jacksonianism is a kind of born out of the frontier spirit where you generally want to leave everybody alone, but it's not an isolationist stance. It's willing to go to defend, obviously, America's territorial interests and its commercial interests overseas. And when there's an affront to national honor, the Jacksonian spirit tends to not temporize, but hit back very, very hard. So it is true that you don't need to speculate. The president said himself about the Syria strike, that the pictures moved him. He said it at a press conference with the Greek prime minister in the Rose Garden before the strike, and he said it from Mar-a-Lago in a televised address after the strike. So he was open about that, but it wasn't the only reason, and I don't even think it was the fundamental reason. The fundamental reason for him was that, and he said this too, that the Obama administration had set a so-called or quote-unquote red line and then failed to enforce it. In his view, in this Jacksonian view in the president's mind, that undermined American credibility and American honor. It made us look weak, and now it emboldened bad regimes to keep doing bad things. And he felt like it would be better if the United States actually lived up to its words. One of the things that Mead points out in that article is that for the Jacksonians, they're very reluctant to make commitments. But once they make a commitment, even an unwise commitment, for instance, admit nations into NATO that are 200 miles from the nearest Russian supply line. Once you've made a foolish commitment, you've got to honor it. I think the president felt, not that he necessarily thought it was a foolish commitment, but he thought that the commitment had been made, the red line had been set, it hadn't been enforced, that America lost something from that. So, I'm just trying to tie those 2 disparate thoughts together, and then I forgot what your question was.
Oh, no, is there an optimal label other than Jacksonian, perhaps?
Well, look, he would say, as he got in, boy, did he get into a lot of trouble, 10 days ago when he was at one of those rallies, and he says, I admit it, I'm a nationalist, and a crowd, 30,000 people in a basketball arena applaud, and the media goes completely insane, and Emmanuel Macron, brings up July 1914 and says you're leading us back to there and all of this, right? There is some thread of, I don't know that there's one word that can encapsulate the president's foreign policy. Nationalism certainly is at the heart of it, but if you got to read his speeches. His foreign policy speeches are really very good and understudied. I suppose when he's tweeting all the time, it's just easier if you're in the media to move from tweet to tweet and crisis to crisis and contretemps one after the other and not pay attention to the speeches. But read, for instance, a very much overlooked speech that he gave in Da Nang, Vietnam in November of last year, about almost exactly 1 year ago. He says to this audience, he basically, and he got a standing ovation. And it's a hall of 700 CEOs and CFOs, so the kind of Davoisie types of people that you'd think all they want to hear about is globalism, and they hate the whole concept of it. But these are CEOs, CFOs, and stuff in East and Southeast Asia on the shadow of a rising China and worried about it. And the president went to them and said, you need to be proud of your own country. You need to strengthen your own countries as we all strengthen our own individual countries and sort of move past the long ago, we've reached the point of diminishing returns on further integration and globalization. We need to strengthen ourselves at home and use that as a basis for a kind of, he didn't say defensive alliance, but something like that, and an arena of economic cooperation. The whole world will be better off. So it's nationalism for Americans, but nationalism for our friends too. Everybody needs to be nationalists or patriots for their own country, put their own country first. And when they do that, we will see more clearly where our true interests overlap, and that will be a firmer basis for better cooperation rather than this sort of sleepwalking or freight train globalist further integration that the foreign policy establishment has for decades insisted is the only way. And the more, and one of the things that's been very clear in the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years is, as I said, we reached the point of diminishing returns on that a while ago, and the foreign policy establishment's response has been just no, more and faster, and they get shriller and shriller about it, and they especially got shrill when a presidential candidate came along to question the wisdom of it, and then they lost their minds when he won.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, I'm glad you brought up the Macron thing, because that's a perfect example of the media's sort of uncritical reporting. Of course, Macron, gave the speech with Donald Trump in attendance and sort of criticized nationalism and said that, it's terrible. Well, the media, of course, reported this, French leader criticizing, this nationalist president, and, this is the European view, this is the French view. Well, nobody in the media that I found noted that Charles de Gaulle, during World War II, when he was in London, safe and sound and trying to direct, some of the resistance from there, actually said, I don't care about whether the British Army wins or loses. I don't care. All I care about is that France triumphs. So the idea that the French have always been anti-nationalist is just ridiculous. But again, the media is very uncritical. Anybody who criticizes Trump, they will report that without really thinking or looking more deeply into what that person said and the context of it.
Jim, let me ask you about labels as well here. Isolationism is a word that has sometimes been applied to Donald Trump and his administration. It's a term that has sometimes been applied to the American Conservative, to Pat Buchanan, who was one of the founding editors of the magazine. What is isolationism? Is there really such a thing, and is it a force in American politics, or is it something of a myth or a bugaboo?
Isolationism is sort of like trickle-down economics, where it's a word that tends to be used by other people to characterize their opponents' views, rather than a label that is generally embraced by the people who are supposedly advocating for it. I think it is a misrepresentation to say that if you are reluctant to bomb and invade and overthrow governments, but you are eager to trade and pursue cultural exchange and have good diplomatic relations, that you are somehow isolationist in some meaningful sense, or that isolates you from the world in some way. I think that there is a wide variety of foreign policy perspectives that go from Robert Taft to Dwight Eisenhower to even things much more. I think under George W. Bush, a lot of the Republican mainstream embraced a threshold for the use of military force abroad that is lower than even what prevailed under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, neither of whom I think could be characterized as isolationists by anyone. So the whole idea that if you're critical of not just the post 9/11, but the post Cold War sort of stumbling and fumbling around for a new Soviet Union to have another Cold War with, that you're isolationist, I think is a fairly absurd contention.
Before we go to question and answer, I wanted to give Michael Anton a chance to say a few more things, and also I wanted to particularly ask him about a concept that he introduced at a Hillsdale Kirby Center panel about a year ago when he was still at the administration. It was this idea of oligarchy. We are all familiar with demagoguery, with the idea that there are certain leaders who can kind of whip up the people and lead them in a dangerous direction. But Michael introduced an innovation which was to talk about forces and people who can do that with respect to the elites and planting rather misleading or dangerous ideas in the minds of the elites, and using the elites as a vehicle with which to sort of pervert the course of the republic. So, Michael, let me ask you to make some comments here.
Well, first I was going to say, look, in the context of 2018, isolationism is just a taunt. It really has no metaphysical, philosophic content anymore. I think it was meaningless or meaningful, a century ago. Remember where the term comes from, the phrase "splendid isolation," in a pre-technological, or in an age with transportation technology was what it was. You ever heard the phrase "the tyranny of distance," which was how the British used to refer to Australia being so far away, or Australians used to refer to themselves. In a way, the United States saw itself not the tyranny of distance, but like the philosopher king of distance, or the beneficent monarch of distance. Having these two big oceans and being really far from the world's problems was a great thing before there were steamships, and certainly before there were jet airplanes and the internet, stuff like that. So nobody's isolated anymore. Nobody can afford to be isolationist. It's a prudential question of how much do you get involved, and where, and for what reasons. There's no way we're going to be able to pull back from everywhere and pretend like the rest of the world doesn't exist anymore. But just as globalism certainly reached diminishing returns, the advance of American power into perhaps places that shouldn't be, and certainly in places it can't affect as much as the advocates for that advance thought it could, that reached diminishing returns quite a while ago. And it's only natural and good that people start thinking about how to retrench and do less, do what's required, but don't do foolish things that aren't required. That's not isolationist. So that when you hear the word, it's just somebody who likes the old paradigm and who's upset that it's going away and just wants to throw an insult at you. Similarly, what is the term realism? Well, I've had teaching a course on some of this stuff this semester, so I had to go back and reread a whole lot of things, including the great 1978 the preface to Hans Morgenthau's 1978 book, in which he gives the 6 point. I'm not going to say what they all are, but he summarizes the 6 points of realism. When you read them, they're all very sensible. Most of them very sensible, and then you wonder, well, how would this distinguish realism as a foreign policy school of thought from anything else? I mean, just the word itself. Do you want to not be realistic? Does anybody want to say, I want to pursue a foreign policy that's unrealistic, that can't possibly achieve what we're setting out to achieve? So it's all a question of prudence, of connecting ends and means. That's all this is about, and that's why one of the reasons I find those schools and the labels and the names altogether not necessarily all that useful, except insofar as they describe genuine intellectual or political movements. So as for oligarchy, or the oligarch, the Hillsdale event was to talk about populism, and I said, look, I have a problem in that I don't know what a populist is, except that I know it's supposed to be bad. Nobody ever uses it as a compliment. If you're a politician running for office anywhere and you are called a populist by the mainstream media or by intellectuals, they mean you are bad, right? Which is interesting because democracy is good. We know democracy is good, but the root word of democracy is the demos, or the body of the common people in Greek. And we know that a demagogue, which is a speaker who appeals to the demos, this is a bad person. Demagogue bad, democracy good. It all gets very, very confusing. And I thought, well, one of the things we don't maybe understand, we don't have a category for a certain type of intellectual, or to use one of Plato's words, rhetor, which is rhetoric without the IC, right? But how do you explain people who essentially serve oligarchy the same way the demagogues are said to or accused of ill-serving the people? So what Dan summarized it is they whip up it's not just that. What an oligarch does, and I have above all in mind people like people on the CFR, Davos, Aspen Institute circuit, the beau ideal, the crystallized, the ethos of the oligarch has got to be Tom Friedman. So what is Tom Friedman's shtick? What does he do? He certainly feeds ideas to the oligarchs, but really the main purpose of oligarchy and the oligarchs is to flatter oligarchy the way the demagogue flatters the demos, and to, in a way, lull the demos into thinking there's no alternative to what these guys are selling. That's all you read from that whole line of thought over and over again is there's no alternative to globalization. There's no alternative to this foreign presence. There's no alternative to further globalization. There's no alternative to this aggressive foreign policy and so on. All the things that have been going on for the last 20 or 30 years that really upset Trump's base and won him the election. Tom Friedman and all the people like him, I can name names, but I'm sure you already named 50 in your own heads. There's no alternative. It has to be this way, and if you object, you're a bad person, and you're going to make the world a worse place. And so It's, the rhetorical trick is partly lull people into acquiescence, and if you can't do that, denounce, 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 push them out of polite company, out of polite conversation, and make those ideas kind of unsayable. That's the rhetorical function of the oligarch, and it's something that we're only beginning to see the outlines of and learning how to push back on. We all need to get a lot better at it.
Kelly, let me ask you in brief, based on some of your international travels recently, you've been to South Korea, and of course you have family in Canada. The media often filters the way supposedly the rest of the world sees the Trump administration. So we often don't hear it directly from foreign media. We hear it instead from our own media, which, as Michael has mentioned, has a rather negative view of the president. And this filter seems like it may have some consequences. Based on your travels, what is your impression of how the Trump administration is seen abroad?
Well, that's a big question, and I'll try to be brief, though. Yeah, it's funny because it reminds me of a tweet from Joyce Carol Oates, the novelist, and she was saying that she's when she goes abroad, she was going abroad on a trip. She's like, I'm embarrassed to be an American, and I'm nervous about going abroad. Well, people in other countries know that not every American voted for Donald Trump. People in other countries know that not every American loves what Donald Trump does, and I was just shocked that a woman who prolific novelist is that silly to think that people in other countries think that because a person was elected that every single person in America likes that person, and people in other countries, they don't assume that every American has the same opinion on things. And so, yeah, I take Uber a lot, and I do it abroad as well, and I always get into interesting conversations with Uber drivers, and it's interesting because if you look at the media here, you think that America is just teeming with white nationalists, Islamophobes. But I had an Uber driver in Paris earlier this year who was telling me that he thinks that France is much more Islamophobic than America, and he himself was born in Morocco, and his family, of course. Not of course, but he told me his family is Muslim. So this idea that, I can safely tell you that people in other countries do not have the same view of America as many in the media do. And that is, to me, a warm thought that people in other countries don't take what we see in our media and think that that's what America is. And whenever I go back home to Canada, or even some of the other countries that I travel to, people are dying to know what I think and what's going on in Washington, which I never got in any other administration. So say what you will about Donald Trump, and I'm not a huge fan of everything he does by any stretch of the imagination, but people are watching and interested, and I think people are sort of debating what America's role in the world is more than they have even, I think, during the George W. Bush years.
Thanks, Kelly. So we're about to take questions. Let me very briefly ask Jim, however, if you could have the media learn one thing about realism, what would it be, in brief?
Well, I think that it exists would be a nice start. The media sort of has a bias toward action anytime there is a problem. So whether the problem is healthcare, whether the problem is poverty, whether the problem is something going wrong overseas, it's never an acceptable answer to say this doesn't have an immediate American government response that will solve this problem. And anybody suggesting that inaction might be the correct course of action in a particular set of circumstances is going to be portrayed in a very negative light. And that narrative only tends to shift on foreign policy when an administration, particularly a Republican administration, performs an intervention that becomes unpopular.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, we have a few minutes here for questions. I see one in the back there. And we think we have a microphone coming your way.
In terms of what any member of the panel who wishes to answer the question would, in terms of the overall, what I see sort of coalescing of possible new foreign policy for the United States is sort of evolving here, has been evolving for a few years now. Of course, the election of Donald Trump makes that a lot more possible than it would have been before. But which members, if any, if you were president of the United States, okay, which one of his advisors would you fire or retire? I know that's a loaded question.
Thank you. Panelists, who'd like to field that?
I think I probably should not.
Jim, how about you?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there is a very high number of people who are George W. Bush alumni in the Trump administration, and while that is somewhat understandable given that that is the talent pool available to a Republican president at this point, including all the people who have not yet aged out of government service, it is problematic if you are attempting to pursue a foreign policy that's different in some substantive way than George W. Bush's. So, the cliche that personnel is policy, cliches exist for a reason. They contain substantial truth. And, when you're seeing the reemergence of, say, a John Bolton, I was more concerned, I think, during the campaign that you'd see Rudy Giuliani being deployed for things other than television lawyering. I thought he might get a foreign policy post, and Chris Christie was obviously who's been a little more restrained, but not much in his foreign policy talk. I thought most of the president's high-level friends did not seem to share his less interventionist impulses, and I think in practice we've seen, maybe with a few exceptions like John Huntsman, who's over in Russia, I just don't see a whole lot of people at high levels. There's no Stephen Miller, for example. You have Stephen Miller, who is somebody in a senior advisory role to the president on immigration, who reinforces the types of things that the president was saying about immigration on the campaign trail, and maybe even believes those things in a more substantive and systematic way than the president himself does. I can't think of somebody on foreign policy who plays any similar role.
I was going to say Peter Navarro immediately comes to mind. And, trade policy is one of those things that really does affect every single American and anybody who lives in America. Anti-free trade policies raise prices for everybody in America. And so I would say you're fired to Peter Navarro.
I'd keep Navarro because I like the way he's drives the policy shift toward China, which is just, here's a great example of massive, unrealistic bipartisan failure. Whether you want to pin the date as 1979 or 1989, it's one of those two. The bipartisan foreign policy establishment of the United States said, our China policy is going to be integrating China into every world body that we can and sort of being their uncle or big brother as we help them rise to the stature of a nation with a seat at the table with all the other nations that play by the rules and so on and so forth, right? We ran that experiment now for 30 years or 40, depending on when you want to pin the date, and it is a failure. It just failed. There's no question about it. And Trump is turning that around. He's changing it. Now, he may make mistakes. He may make mistakes along the way. Certain things may work. Other things may not work. But at least he's not going with the oligarch. There's no other way. The Tom Friedman would say, we just have to keep doing exactly what we've been doing with China for almost a half century, which has been failing and we've been losing, but there's no other way. You got to keep doing it. And Navarro is an intellectual and engine behind that, so I appreciate him being there. I would say two other things. One, I watch presidential campaigns, but I'm not the greatest expert. But I'm pretty sure that it has never happened in a presidential campaign of either party for not just foreign policy hands, but whether they be economic policy or trade policy or agriculture policy hands, to organize letters saying this person, my nominee is completely unfit and I won't work for him, and go recruit hundreds of people to sign these letters disqualifying themselves from ever serving in an administration. So this administration came in incredibly handicapped on the national security side because of the efforts of the people who organized those letters and the people who signed them. So that's point one. The personnel challenges are enormous. They've never been, and they would have been anyway, because Trump is a transformative figure for the party. So even had nobody done the letters, he was still trying to take the party on foreign policy and other things in such different directions that it would have made, you don't do it. He wasn't in a position to do what is normally done, which is just hire everybody from the last administration, but give them a job one bump up from where they were the last time. So to the extent that he has hired people who are in the Bush administration, they are people who at least profess to be closer to what he says he wants to do, or to not object to it, or trying to implement it. And then I guess two more very short things. Who knows what would have happened had Mike Flynn lasted longer than 24 days? Then maybe he would have his Stephen Miller type in the White House on foreign policy, closer to that vision. Who knows? But the National Security Advisor is it's a weak, strong, weak position. Your strength is proximity to the president, time you get to spend with the president. Your weakness is your staff is tiny, your budget's tiny, and you have no line authority to tell any agency what to do, really. And then the last thing I would say is just in terms of the word intervention has come up. It would be one thing if Trump had come in, hired a bunch of Bush people, and then invaded some country. He hasn't done that. Right? The only two things that I could call interventions are the two, because he struck Syria twice over the chemical weapons things. Those are the only things that he's done that you could say are maybe surprising interventions. He did amp up the U.S. activity against ISIS in Syria and Iraq without increasing the U.S. troop presence, however. But he said he was, you can't say he didn't tell you he was going to do that. He said he was going to do that all throughout 2015 and 2016. So he just kept a promise. And I can tell you one of the things that he didn't do that would have happened had Hillary Clinton won, and which is one of the reasons why so many of the former Republicans and conservatives have bailed and are so angry at Trump. They really, really wanted the United States to get right down, boots on the ground into the Syrian civil war. And Trump knew from the beginning he wasn't going to do that, and has been implored to do that by some, and has resisted all along, and I think to his great credit. And it got so bad that you had people on the Democrats and among Republicans who called themselves conservatives openly advocating that the United States ally itself with al-Qaeda groups in Syria to win the Syrian civil war, moderate al-Qaeda, or it'll be a marriage of convenience and stuff. So a good friend of mine, I wish I had thought of this, but a good friend of mine said he was Trump skeptical in the election, got into a debate with some people who were arguing about this, and he said, I'm not never Trump. I can see his drawbacks. This is him speaking, not me. I can see his drawbacks. I can see his strengths. But I can tell you one thing I am that not everybody in this room is. I am never al-Qaeda. And, he was, of course, castigated for that impertinent remark.
So we have time for one or two more questions. There's one in the back there.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is, how would Mr. Trump react if there is a serious crisis in South Asia? As you know, there are elections in India, and the newly elected Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan is very unpredictable. Like Trump, he is very kind of emotionally unstable, exactly like Trump. And he wanted to have peace with India, but as you know, Pakistan is not a failing but failed state. They cannot compete with India, and the only shorthand they have is kind of bring nuke on the border like it happened a few years ago on Kargil crisis. So if you have that kind of situation, what do you think Trump would do? Given that the BJP, the current regime in India, wants to win the election, and for them, the best way to win the election is to create trouble with Pakistan. And for Imran Khan, the best solution is because he cannot resolve economic problems in Pakistan. So for him, this is best if India start conflict, Imran is not going to stop. He would, want to do something that would bring his nation together. So again, my question is, if this kind of situation transpire in South Asia, how would Trump react? Thanks.
Good question, hard question. Michael, do you want to take that?
No.
I think Kelly has.
I'll just say, very briefly. First of all, there is something that he doesn't have in common with Trump, and that's that he's in shape. He's a cricketer, and actually is in good shape. But I was just going to say briefly, if you recall, when Donald Trump did his big Afghanistan speech, it was sort of almost a pivot to India, and he, called out Pakistan and said, you guys are helping terrorists, you're supporting terrorism, we are going to cut off aid to you if you don't shape up. And we've seen actually he followed through on that in to some degree, and he looked like he was actually going to be working on having a closer relationship with India. Now, we haven't heard much since then, and I admit I don't know what's been going on behind the scenes with that. But I think people working for Donald Trump understand that Donald Trump himself might not fully know this, but people working under him understand how much trouble Pakistan can be causing in the region. And so I think if something like that there would be people that would be urging him to further punish Pakistan. I don't know if he would want to do it, but he certainly spoke very strongly about it in that Afghanistan speech.
Jim, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I mean, I know this is the least popular answer to give to any question in D.C., but I think the real answer is I don't know. I mean, he clearly has a tilt against Pakistan, but not quite as pronounced as his tilt against Iran. These things could produce some bad outcomes if they go the wrong way. But on the other hand, while Trump has not improved some bad situations and maybe made some bad situations worse, he's never really lived up to the Ronnie Reagan sort of stereotype that Ronald Reagan had to contend with either, that he was just going to pop off and cause all kinds of calamitous events and put us at risk of nuclear war, at least not yet. So I don't know how exactly he would react, but so far, generally, he's never as non-interventionist as lesser interventionists would hope, and he's never quite as crazy as his Twitter feed might lead people to believe.
We are just about at the end of time. We have a very brief question in the back, sir. Yes. Microphone, please.
I'm sorry.
And please identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Khalili. I work as an engineer, actually. I'm not a politics person, but I have a question about Iran. I think in American Conservative, I believe August issue, you had an article, Rand Paul against the world, something like that. And that article was mentioning that Senator Paul is basically alone among the conservatives in opposing war or attack on Iran, despite the opinions of the people who are actually in the National Security Council or State Department. So my opinion is, in terms of realism, what was your opinion on this matter? Does it make sense to confront Iran at this stage with the problems in Saudi Arabia and, of course, generally in the Middle East in such an abrupt manner, or would realism dictate doing a different course of action? Thank you.
I'm not aware. I mean, maybe I'm naive or uninformed. I'm not aware of anybody in the government that actually wants to attack Iran. I mean, it wasn't the president didn't get out of the Iran deal as a prelude to war, as a lot of people worried about. And this just shows, it's a further illustration of how impoverished our categories are. You either kind of are in, full-on accommodation mode, or you're going to war and there's nothing in the middle. And I'm sure I will be unpopular in this audience by making the following points, although Kelly Jane kind of already made them too. And she works for the Weekly Standard, everybody, remember that. Look, the Iranian regime has been an enemy of the United States since 1979. It continues to be an enemy of the United States. Now, the question is, how much power can it actually project? How much can it hurt us? It hurt us a lot when we had a lot of troops on the ground in Iraq, especially in Iraq. You could argue about the wisdom of that, and I completely come your way on that myself, so unwise. But even in an unwise situation, when you have your guys in uniform on the ground and an enemy regime is facilitating fighters to go kill them and shipping IEDs in there, right? That's an affront to the United States, and we should do something about it and defend ourselves. So that problem isn't so much of a problem anymore because the troops aren't there anymore. I think what Trump is trying to do is not as a prelude to war, but it's just to recognize that Iran is an enemy of the United States. The Iran deal was enriching the regime, and with those riches, it uses them to spend them on activities that destabilize the Middle East and harm U.S. interests. So he'd like them to be less rich and have less resources to do that stuff with rather than more rich. It doesn't mean he wants to go to war. And I mean, there may be somebody somewhere in the administration who does, but I don't know who that person is. And I think even if they exist, the president will just overrule them.
Well, amen to that.
1 minute, yeah.
Amen to that. And I just want, it's true, this idea that you're either for full-on accommodation or you're for war. And I have to agree with Michael here. And I cover Iran a lot, and I've talked to, young people who have been imprisoned and tortured under this regime. Everyone says Rouhani's a moderate. Well, moderates apparently in Iran torture people too. And what they overwhelmingly tell me is what they want is an end to appeasement. They don't want America to be coming in with tanks and weapons. They want an end to appeasement. They are tired of having the West, as Michael said, enrich this regime. I mean, the money that the regime got through the Iran deal, none of that went to the people. It went to Hezbollah. It went to help Bashar al-Assad in Syria. It doesn't help the people at all. And so, yeah, this idea, like I report on a lot of the human rights abuses going on in Iran, and people say, well, because you're reporting on this, you must want us to go to war with Iran. And it's ridiculous, and it's frustrating to me. And again, the media has this laziness, and not just the media, really, even people in foreign policy a lot of times have this. And so, I think, Donald Trump made a great decision there. It is not in the U.S. interest to help enrich a regime whose leaders regularly lead chants of death to America. And I do want to say, though, it's the leaders doing this, not the people. Now, the protests that have been going on for nearly a year now, some of the things that they are saying is, you lie when you say the enemy is America. The enemy is right here at home. I think the Iranian people are some of the most pro-American people in the world, let alone the Middle East. It's the current leaders who, of course, need a scapegoat. And so just let me echo Michael's comments on that.
Thanks, Kelly. And Jim, you get the last word for about 1 minute.
I mean, a lot of people talked about, a lot of the same people saying these things now about Iran talked about regime change and no war in the late 90s. And they were singing a very different tune come 2002, come 2003. Doesn't mean history necessarily will repeat itself, but you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little bit skeptical.
Very good. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our panelists.